Libido Dominandi by E. Michael Jones. All rights reserved to E. Michael Jones. Part 1, Chapter 4, Paris, 1792. On October the 28th, 1792, at around the same time that Mary Wollstonecraft's infatuation with Henry Fuseli was reaching its climax and rapid denouement, the Marquis de Sade wrote a tract on the hospitals of Paris, which so impressed his revolutionary colleagues in the Commune of the section d'Epique that they had it reprinted and sent it to the other 47 sections in Paris. Sade followed up on this success by writing another pamphlet, quote, Idea on the Law's Mode of Sanction, end quote, a few days later on November the 2nd. In it he argued for a monocameral legislature to replace the now imprisoned king. This position differed from the position he held a year earlier, in which he advocated a bicameral legislature, much like the one in place in England. France was now at the beginning of its estrangement from things English. The pamphlet on hospitals signaled the beginning of Sade's rise as a politician. In this he was, at least initially, more successful than in his career as a playwright. 7 months earlier, on March the 5th, the Sans-Culottes had shut down his play Le Soupçonneur. Thrust onto the stage of life by political events, Sade soon learned that his abilities as a dramatist, and even more so, his talent as an actor, would serve him in good stead in the ongoing psychodrama that was the French Revolution. Mary Wollstonecraft arrived in Paris in December of 1792 under a grey and threatening sky, just in time to see the King of France, now known as Citizen Capet, trundled back and forth to his trial for treason in a vehicle which the French called a fiacre and the English a hackney coach. Since Miss Wollstonecraft had arrived in France to write her book on the French Revolution without having first learned the rudiments of the French language, her most striking impressions were visual. At 9 o'clock on the morning of December the 26th, Wollstonecraft watched the King of France pass by her window. She was struck by his dignity, by the silence, made all the more apparent by the occasional strokes on the drum, by the emptiness of the streets, and by the realization that all of Paris was watching the king pass to his trial and eventually death from behind their closed windows, as she was. Still revolutionary, Wollstonecraft was even more impressed with the dignity of the French people, whose language was at this point still incomprehensible. She was, quote, unable to utter a word, end quote, and so, quote, stunned by the flying sounds, end quote, that she went to bed, quote, each night with a headache, end quote. Quote, I bowed to the majesty of the people, end quote, she wrote to Johnson, quote, and respected the propriety of behavior so perfectly in unison with my own feelings, end quote. Then, inexplicably, given her Republican sympathies, she burst into tears at the prospect of the king, quote, sitting with more dignity than I expected from his character, in a hackney coach, going to meet his death, end quote. The spiritual daughter of the Puritans who beheaded King Charles was, it turns out, more affected by the prospect of regicide than she expected. Wollstonecraft says that, lifting her eye from the letter she was writing, she saw eyes glaring at her, quote, through a glass door opposite of my chair, end quote. And what is more prophetic, quote, bloody hands shook at me, end quote. Since it couldn't have been the servants whose apartments were in a remote part of the house, Wollstonecraft concludes that it must have been phantoms of her troubled imagination, or perhaps a vision of things to come. She concluded by wishing that she had her cat or some other living creature by her as an antidote to this pervasive feeling of death all around her. Quote, death in so many frightful shapes has taken hold of my fancy. I am going to bed, and for the first time in my life I cannot put out the candle, end quote. Revolutionary passion, she would soon discover, had taken on a life of its own. On January the 21st, 1793, a little less than a month after Wollstonecraft arrived in Paris, King Louis XVI was decapitated in the front of decapitated statue of his father at the Place de la Révolution, which is now known as the Place de la Concorde. Wollstonecraft evidently did not attend the execution, which would have been in keeping with her coverage of the Revolution, because she mentions in a letter to Ruth Barlow, only in passing, while discussing her continuing inability to understand the French language. Wollstonecraft had moved out of her original lodgings and was now living with the Christies and circulating largely in the radical Anglophone community there, composed of both Americans and Englishmen of equally Republican sensibilities. While in Paris, she renewed her acquaintance with Tom Paine, who had fled to France to avoid a sedition trial in England. While in Paris, she also made the acquaintance of Helen Maria Williams, a poetess with revolutionary sympathies, whose writings had inspired the young William Wordsworth. Wordsworth, in fact, set off to Orleans in December of 1791 to be with Miss Williams, but found after he arrived that she had gone to Paris to get a better view of the Revolution. Wordsworth met instead a Captain Bupole, who introduced him to the Republican cause. While in Orleans, Wordsworth also met a young woman by the name of Annette Vallon, who began their relationship by giving French lessons and ended up getting pregnant by him. By the late fall of 1792, the baby, christened Caroline, had been born. Wordsworth, who still hadn't got around to marrying the mother of their child, had by now run out of money, and on top of that, the political situation had changed drastically as well. The Englishmen who had been feted 2 summers ago as harbingers of liberty were now considered enemies of the state. Shortly thereafter, England declared war on France, and would remain at war for the next 22 years, until the defeat of Napoleon, preventing Wordsworth from carrying out his plan of bringing Annette and their child to live with him in England. When he returned to England, Wordsworth was supposed to take a position in the ministry, his only prospect for employment at the time. Just how he was to square with a Roman Catholic wife and a daughter born out of wedlock must have given him pause. Perhaps this is why he didn't go straight back to England after leaving Annette. Perhaps he was just curious about the events in Paris. Whatever the reason, he stayed there for months, and as a result, and as the political situation darkened, his resolve to marry Annette seems to have faded away as well. Wordsworth finally returned to England in late December of 1792. The date corresponds so closely to Wollstonecraft's journey to Paris that we can almost imagine the 2 English radicals sailing by each other in opposite directions across the Channel. The journeys would have been symbolic as well. By the turn of the century, Wordsworth had abandoned his youthful radicalism completely, and would go on to become the epitome of cultural and political conservatism. The story of Wordsworth's youthful indiscretion, which would fester like an unhealed wound at the heart of his art, would not come out until the 1920s. The trauma which the first sexual revolution caused was so severe that, in the case of Wordsworth and Shelley in particular, it was blotted completely from the public record. As of 1793, however, Wordsworth was far from his infatuation with radical politics. In fact, in the early part of the year, his radicalism would reach new heights, propelled there by the publishing event of the year. On February the 13th, 1793, Godwin's book, entitled An Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Political Justice, went on sale in London. It was, depending on your point of view, the exactly right moment or the exactly wrong moment for a book extolling the Enlightenment. The illusions of the English Jacobins were like an increasingly large balloon that was expanding to ever closer and ever more perilous contact with the actual revolution in France, which had taken a decidedly bloody turn in the late summer and early fall of 1792. On December the 19th, 1792, a month before Louis XVI's execution, the Attorney General in London brought a seditious libel charge against Thomas Paine, who fled to France to join the increasingly bloody revolution still in progress there. As the Marquis de Sade had noticed in France, so Godwin had noticed in England. Newtonian physics, which was the ultimate basis of Enlightenment thought, had sexual implications. If man is just a machine made up of matter in motion, running on electricity, then marriage as a sacred bond between man and wife made no more sense in England than it did in France. Quote, "The institution of marriage," quote, end quote, Godwin wrote in a way that scandalized the traditionalists even more than it energized the revolutionaries, quote, "is a system of fraud, and men who carefully mislead their judgments in the daily affair of their life must always have a crippled judgment in every other concern. Add to this that marriage is an affair of property, and the worst of all properties. So long as the two human beings are forbidden by positive institutions to follow the dictates of their own mind, prejudice is alive and vigorous. So long as I seek to engross one woman to myself, and to prohibit my neighbor from proving his superior desert and reaping the fruits of it, I am guilty of the most odious of all monopolies." End quote. Godwin was unmarried when he wrote these lines. It is to his credit as a human being that he modified his thought when his state of life changed. But it is not to his credit as a philosopher that he did so. It was statements like this that prompted Leslie Stephen to say that his philosophy was a bubble which burst when it made contact with reality. The views Godwin expressed on the relations between the sexes had their roots in the revolution in France, and so it could come as no surprise that they rose and fell in relation to that event, as perceived by the English. The immediate result of the book was that Godwin became famous overnight. In his diary, Godwin noted that, quote, "I was nowhere, a stranger," end quote, after the publication of his book on political justice. Quote, "He blazed as a sun in the firmament," end quote, wrote William Hazlitt, and like moths drawn to a light, the English Jacobins flew to his door, and more often than not were singing by the contact with his ideas. Quote, "Throw aside your books of chemistry," end quote, wrote Wordsworth, advising another young student, quote, "and read Godwin on necessity," end quote. 2 years after the book's publication, the young Jacobins in England were still under its spell. Quote, "It was in the spring of this year," end quote, wrote radical author Crabb Robinson in 1795, quote, "that I read a book which gave a turn to my mind and in effect directed the whole course of my life, a book which, after producing a powerful effect on the youth of the generation, has now sunk into unmerited oblivion. I entered fully into its spirit. It left all others behind in my admiration, and I was willing even to become a martyr for it." End quote. Robinson's quote indicates that Godwin's star was waning on the literary horizon as fast as it rose. Soon it would set all together as Wordsworth, Southey, and Coleridge changed their minds about both Godwin and their youthful indiscretions and the revolution which enabled both. But this story was far from over at this point. In fact, the younger generations of romantic writers, especially Shelley, was in many ways to fulfill Robinson's prediction and become a martyr to the cause of unfettered passion. In the meantime, as if to prove Burke right and Godwin wrong, the revolution in France proceeded headlong into bloody excess. After urging the Parisian mob to sack the city's prisons and murder their inmates, Robespierre consolidated his hold on power throughout the winter of 1792 and 93. In a political climate in which the rise to power and the subsequent loss of one's head could be measured in a matter of weeks, the Marquis de Sade found that politics took a singularly bizarre turn when the Bastille's most famous prisoner suddenly was made a judge. On April the 8th, 1793, Sade, along with 19 other citizens, was appointed to a jury to investigate a case of counterfeit assignats. Quote, "They'll never guess," end quote, he wrote to Gaufredi. Quote, "I am a judge, yes, a judge, member of an member of an investigating jury. Who would have predicted that? As you see, my mind is maturing, and I am beginning to acquire wisdom. But congratulate me, and above all, do not fail to send money to Monsieur le Judge, or I'll be damned if I don't sentence you to death." The Marquis de Sade may have been joking about sentencing Goffredy to death, but during the month of March, with the establishment of the committees of surveillance and the Revolutionary Tribunal, one didn't need to be a judge to put someone's life in jeopardy. After the years of his married life spent lording his aristocratic heritage over his in-laws, the Montreuils, citizen Sade was now in position to exact revenge on them for their unjust treatment of him. Sensing the family's danger, and moved by a sense of desperation that must have been extreme, Sade's aged father-in-law showed up at his apartment in the section de Pique. It was also during March of 1793 that the first organized resistance to the revolution broke out in France. In August of 1792, all priests who refused to take an oath of submission were deported. It was one such group that was massacred in Paris. Those who refused to submit and were not killed went into hiding, and when they did, the agitation against the revolution smoldered, and then finally broke out into flame in the west of France, when the government tried to conscript 300,000 troops to fight foreign invaders. When the draft was announced in the first days of March, rioting followed, and the men of draft age fled to towns and regrouped in the forests. Then on March the 11th, 12th, and then 13th, they counterattacked, taking St. Florent, Chanzeux, Machecoul, and Chalons, and ultimately every major town in the region. The Republican forces were stunned not only by the ferocity of the attack, but by the vehemence of the anti-revolutionary fervor. For the first time since it began, the revolution was in danger, not from foreign troops in the pay of dispossessed aristocrats, but by the very peasants and artisans who were presumed to be revolution's main beneficiaries. The fact that they seemed inspired by their Catholic faith, from which they had been so recently liberated, only made the uprising more perplexing from the Republican point of view. During the spring of 1793, at around the same time, the Vendée uprisings began, and roughly 4 months after her arrival in Paris, while Godwin's sun was rising in the literary firmament in England, and the Marquis de Sade was beginning his judiciary career, Mary Wollstonecraft, in Godwin's words, quote, entered into that species of connection for which her heart secretly panted, end quote. The man's name was Gilbert Imlay. He was an American adventurer, quote, with no matrimonial ties, end quote, an agent of the Scioto Land Development Company who had written a well-received book on Kentucky, and who would soon follow it up by a novel called The Emigrants, which was, in spite of its title, a tract on the advantages of free love and divorce. The romance may have happened suddenly, but it was not a case of love at first sight. In fact, in many respects, it was a case of the exact opposite. Wollstonecraft, who met Imlay at the Barlows, Godwin says it was at the Christie's, found him arrogant and self-absorbed. But gradually the magic potion of passion turned Bottom's ass head into something which Wollstonecraft found not only attractive, but irresistibly so. On April the 12th, after the British came to aid of the counter-revolutionaries at Toulon, all foreigners who were prohibited from leaving France, an act which put the English, whose country was now at war with France, in the position of being denounced and arrested. Americans, allies in the revolutionary struggle of France against England, were not liable to arrest. And so to ensure Wollstonecraft's safety, Imlay registered her as his wife at the American embassy, although the two never married. The marriage of convenience seemed to fulfill Wollstonecraft's prediction that she would take a husband for a time, although by the time she was fully involved in a relationship, Brevity was the last thing on her mind. In fact, Wollstonecraft was caught off guard by the passions she so light-heartedly described in her letter proposing to take a husband for a time. Wollstonecraft, who was still a virgin at the time, was talking about sexual passion based mostly on what she had read. She didn't reckon with the ties that sexual intercourse created willy-nilly. No matter what revolutionary dispensation she professed, Wollstonecraft was binding herself to a man she had originally found physically attractive but morally repugnant. By late June, when her first extant letter to Imlay appears, Wollstonecraft had already moved into their secluded bower in Neuilly-sur-Seine, where they would spend an idyllic summer together, mutually gratifying their respective sexual passions, as the French continued unobserved in Paris, gratifying passions of a bloodier sort. 1 year before, during the summer of 1792, Lady Palmerston had noticed an abrupt change in the general mood of the Parisian public, from an optimism which versed on euphoria at times to a mood which plummeted just before the September massacres to, quote, an air of ferocity and self-created consequences in the common people, end quote, which made her, quote, very uncomfortable, end quote. In 1793, the mood was back again, but Mary was too busy enjoying, if not connubial bliss, then its counterfeit, while working on what she termed, quote, a great book, end quote, an historical and moral view of the origin and progress of the French Revolution. In the end, the book would prove to be as great as the relationship. During the summer of 1793, Mary would take evening walks in the woods near Neuilly, in spite of the warnings from the gardener, who seems to have developed an attachment to Mary, and desired to serve her by making her bed and bringing her grapes. The affair ended with the season. In September, Mary announced that she was pregnant, and shortly after the announcement, Imlay announced that he had to go to Le Havre, then known as Havre Marat, on business. It seems clear with the benefit of hindsight that the pregnancy precipitated the break. Imlay was a libertine and a sexual adventurer whose head was full of the same republican attitudes towards marriage that Godwin was popularizing in England at the time. He had therefore no intention of binding himself to a woman, even if that woman was pregnant with his child. He also had no desire to state his intentions openly, thereby precipitating an unpleasant scene or foreclosing future options. So, under the pretext of business, he simply disappeared, and Mary was left to while away the months and weeks of her pregnancy, wondering what was taking him so long. She soon began to give vent to her irritation in letters that take on a tone which has endeared them to subsequent generations of feminists. Quote, amongst the feathered race, end quote, she wrote, quote, whilst the hen keeps the young warm, her mate stays by to cheer her. But it is sufficient for a man to condescend to get a child in order to claim it. A man is a tyrant, end quote. During the fall of 1793, Wollstonecraft remained in Paris, waiting for Imlay's return as Robespierre tightened his grasp on the reins of power, and blood began to flow ever more freely in the streets. It's hard to imagine a more ideal position from which to write a history of the French Revolution, but by now, perhaps because of her personal anguish at being abandoned after abandoning herself to her own passions, the Revolution was a text which Wollstonecraft simply could not read. If she sensed the connection between sexual passion and its bloody political seculae, she seems to have kept this far to herself, even if the evidence was all around her. On October 16, 1793, 10 months after the death of her husband, Marie Antoinette was dragged to the scaffold and decapitated as well. In the same month, Mary Wollstonecraft walked from Neuilly to Paris, and while crossing the Place de Révolution, slipped and nearly fell. Looking down, she discovered that the entire plaza was slippery with the blood of the recently slain. Unable to contain herself any longer, quote, the emotions of his soul burst forth in indignant exclamations, end quote, which were imprudent for anyone to utter at the time, but were especially imprudent coming from the mouth of an expatriate Englishwoman. If she hadn't been led away from the scene by a concerned companion, it is entirely possible that her blood might have been mixed in with all the rest. The terror was reaching its full fury, and as it did, Mary Wollstonecraft was no longer able to comprehend what was going on. This was most assuredly not what the Reverend Price had in mind when he compared what was happening in France with their brother's glorious revolution. Wollstonecraft had come to France with a mind formed by categories established in Price's sermon. Had she not become involved with Imlay, it's possible that some of the thoughts which she had expressed on passion in her attack on Burke might have reasserted themselves and allowed for a more realistic apprehension of what was going on. But as it was, her mind never really gained any purchase on the meaning of the events unfolding around her. On July the 23rd, 1793, the Marquis de Sade's metamorphosis from aristocrat to republican became complete when he was named president of the section de Pique. Less than a month later he was gone, forced out of office, because he refused to put what he termed, quote, a horrible inhumane measure, end quote, to a vote. Lever speculates that it might have been the destruction of the Vendée, or the transfer of Marie Antoinette to the Conciergerie, which meant placing her one step closer to a trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal and her death. It turns out that the author of the 120 Days of Sodom wasn't bloodthirsty enough for his revolutionary colleagues. As a parting gesture, he also spared the lives of the Montreuils by putting them on the, quote, purification list, end quote. Lacking resolve as an executioner, Sade returned to the realm of the mind, where he could give his ferocity full rein. On October the 9th, 1793, he delivered his, quote, discourse to the shades of Marat and Le Pelletier, end quote, at a quasi-religious ceremony complete with incense and busts of slain heroes. Emboldened by his success, Sade launched an all-out attack on religion on November the 15th, when 6 sections, including Sade's section de Pique, renounced all religion except the religion of liberty. Sade may have paled before bloodshed, but he could always warm to atheism, which was in many ways the core of his belief, or lack thereof. Quote, reason is replacing Mary in our temples, end quote, Sade told the convention. Quote, and the incense that used to burn at the knees of an adulterous woman will from now on be kindled only at the feet of the goddess who broke our chains. The philosopher has long laughed in secret at the apish antics of Catholicism. But if he dared to raise his voice, it was in the dungeons of the Bastille, where ministerial despotism soon learned how to compel its silence. How could tyranny fail to bolster superstition? Both were nurtured in the same cradle. Both were daughters of fanaticism. Both were served by those useless creatures known as priests of the temple and the monarch of the throne. Having a common foundation, they could not but protect each other, end quote. Sade was using his newfound prominence as political orator to articulate the philosophy of the revolutionary state, which was by its nature antithetical to both religion and morals, and therefore dedicated to the promotion of passion as a civic virtue. Sade would go on to articulate the idea more fully 2 years later. For the moment, though, he was too involved in politics to realize that he had committed serious blunder. Sade's speech, announcing that, quote, man is finally enlightened, end quote, was an unabashed expression of his atheism. But unfortunately it came less than a week before Robespierre decided to call an end to the anti-Christian campaign on November the 22nd. Sade was persona non grata once again, and once again on the 18th of Frimaire in the year 2, which is to say on December the 8th, 1793, he was arrested. This time he was taken to a former convent of the Filles de Madeleine and interned, since all the cells were full, in the prison's latrine, where Sade would spend the next 6 weeks. Sade was to learn that revolutionary justice was more draconian than the sort that he had endured at the Bastille at the hand of the Ancien regime. Thrown in with the cream of the aristocratic society, Sade discussed literature and politics while awaiting his execution. On January the 8th, he learned that his publisher, Girouard, had been guillotined. A week later, Mary Wollstonecraft, now in the second trimester of her pregnancy, and tired of waiting for Imlay to return to Paris, decided to go visit him instead in Le Havre, where he was staying while doing business. Mary had spent the fall analyzing their relationship in letters, and the verdict was not hopeful. Quote, "Of late we are always separating," end quote. She wrote in September, quote, "Crack, crack, and away you go. This joke wears the sallow cast of thought, for though I began to write cheerfully, some melancholy tears have found their way into my eyes that linger there, whilst the glow of tenderness at my heart whispers that you are one of the best creatures in the world." End quote. Wollstonecraft's heart, no matter how tender, was contending with her mind, whose verdict about Imlay, even at this early stage of the game, was uniformly negative. Quote, "I have found that I have more mind than you in one respect," end quote. She wrote in the same letter, quote, "because I can, without any violent effort of reason, find food for love in the same object much longer than you can. The way to my senses is through my heart, but forgive me, I think there is sometimes a shorter cut to yours." End quote. On March the 27th, 1794, Sade was transferred yet again to another prison, this time Picpus, which again had an aristocratic clientele, including the wife of the Duc d'Orléans, one of the aristocrats who fomented the revolution and who was known as Philippe Égalité, until he succumbed to the revolution's excesses as well. On July the 26th, 1794, Fouquier-Tinville, the notorious executioner during the Terror, issued an indictment against Sade, charging him with maintaining, quote, "intelligence and correspondence with the enemies of the Republic," end quote, and being a, quote, "vile satellite," end quote, of Citizen Capet's conspiracy to overthrow the revolution. The punishment was death, and on the next day the accused were trundled off to the scaffold. By the time they arrived, however, Sade was not with them. The bailiff couldn't find him when he came to his cell to take him to the scaffold. The remaining 27 prisoners were almost saved by the public revulsion at the Terror that would bring it to an end the next day, when Robespierre himself lost his head. Almost, but not quite. Sade was finally released on October the 15th, and by then the revulsion at Robespierre, known as the Thermidorian reaction, was in full swing. Sade was a free man once again, although because he had to pay for the 312 days he spent in prison, he was once again deep in debt. In June 1794, at the height of the Great Terror, Godwin responded to a correspondent who expected him to be critical of the French Revolution now, that it had shown its true and bloody face, by defending Robespierre as, quote, "an eminent benefactor of mankind," end quote. In August of 1794, with Robespierre in his grave and the reaction gaining ground, Imlay rushed back to Paris from London to see what was going on. While there, he met with Mary, who had given birth to their child, alone, on May the 14th. Mary named the child Frances, after a childhood friend, or Fanny for short, and told Ruth Barlow that in spite of her early writings to the contrary, she found, quote, great pleasure in being a mother, end quote. She was also grateful for the, quote, constant tenderness of my most affectionate companion, end quote, regarding the, quote, fresh tie, end quote, as a blessing. Imlay, however, was of another mind when it came to the matrimonial ties, fresh or otherwise, and shortly after he arrived in Paris he was on his way back to London again, with the assurance that he would send for Mary and the baby in a few months. What followed was the bleakest period of Mary's life, a time which corresponded with one of the most brutally cold winters of modern time. Abandoned in Paris, in penury and bitter cold, Mary took consolation in analyzing her relationship with Imlay in her letters. They are not letters which we can imagine Imlay rejoiced to receive. At the heart of her letters was the growing realization that Imlay was indifferent to both Mary and her daughter. She had given her heart to him, and he had simply used her as a convenience for the moment. The relationship had lasted during the summer of 1793, and had ended when Mary announced that she was pregnant, which was when it began in earnest for her. Mary's previous claim that no one should be forced to remain in a relationship where mutual affection had ceased now rang hollow and unrealistic in light of the child that had been the fruit of that relationship. Now that Imlay was gone, she was left to carry that burden by herself. Godwin, in the meantime, was preparing a second edition of Political Justice, this time with an expanded sectional marriage. Infidelity, he wrote, was loathsome only when it was concealed. It was the sort of thing Imlay would like to hear, but it was no longer possible to Mary Wollstonecraft, who spent her time writing letters she hoped would awaken Imlay's slumbering conscience. Quote, "Should your sensibility ever awake," end quote, she wrote to Imlay, quote, "remorse will find its way to your heart, and, in the midst of business and sensual pleasure, I shall appear to you, the victim of your deviation from rectitude." End quote. One biographer claims that Mary playing Banquo's ghost here, quote, "sets up a faint irritation in the reader." End quote. That irritation probably depends on the reader, but more apropos literary reference in this regard would be the monster in Frankenstein, who announces to his creator, quote, "I will be with you on your wedding night." End quote. When he refuses to create for him a mate, "I will be with you on your wedding night," end quote, when he refuses to create for him a mate. Conscience, in other words, is bound to ruin sexual pleasure. The reference is especially apropos because Frankenstein was written by Mary Wollstonecraft's second daughter, the daughter she would never see, who had been rereading the letters her mother had written to Imlay when she wrote the book. The monster, in this context, always represents and articulates the insights which the author finds difficult to admit to herself, and at this phase in her life Mary Wollstonecraft was beginning to understand that the revolutionary philosophy was failing when it came in contact with life. Not only did it not explain anything, it rendered those who espoused it incapable of understanding what was going on around them. It rendered them blind, because it was a species of lust, and lust darkened the mind. The new philosophy Mary Wollstonecraft was learning in the expensive school of experience was simply a form of rationalization. Quote, "I have no criterion for morality," end quote, she wrote to Imlay, quote, "and I have fought in vain if the sensation which led you to follow an ankle, or step, be the sacred foundation of principle or affection. Mine has been a very different nature, or it would not have stood the brunt of your sarcasm. The sentiment in me is still sacred. If there be any part of me that will survive the sense of my misfortunes, it is the purity of my affections. The impetuosity of your senses may have led you to term mere animal desire the source of principle." End quote. Morality for Imlay was simply rationalized desire. Those who accepted that belief and acted on it were, as the Enlightenment would say, machines, which is what the Marquis de Sade and de la Mettrie had been saying all along. It is only after she had given birth, that Mary could see sexuality in terms other than the mechanical and expedient. Again she writes to Imlay and tries to articulate a philosophy that is the antithesis of what she claimed to believe as an English sexual revolutionary. Quote, "The impulse of the senses, passions, if you will, and the conclusions of reason draw men together. But the imagination is true fire, stolen from heaven, to animate this cold creature of clay, producing all those fine sympathies that lead to rapture, rendering men social by expanding their hearts, instead of leaving them leisure to calculate how many comforts society affords." End quote. Once again we have an image that will reappear in Frankenstein, whose subtitle, quote, "The Modern Prometheus," end quote, adverts to electricity as the fire stolen from heaven. Unlike Benjamin Franklin and the philosophers who admired his experiments, Wollstonecraft is forever attempting to infuse the images of enlightenment with the moral patrimony of the West, which they were created to replace. Instead of using Newtonian terms like force to rationalize immorality, the Enlightenment project in a nutshell, Wollstonecraft is forever trying to rehumanize desire by connecting it to the heart. Her carping about men in general, and Imlay in particular, gives her writing the ring of contemporary feminism. Yet the thrust of her argument is the opposite. Quote, "You know my opinion of men in general," end quote, she writes in that vein. Quote, "You know that I think them systematic tyrants, and that it is the rarest thing in the world to meet with a man with sufficient delicacy of feeling to govern desire." End quote. Men are tyrants, in other words, because they cannot govern desire. Their desires govern them. The psychology Wollstonecraft applies in her diatribe against men, like her diatribe against Burke, is based on both traditional morality and psychology. Reason is meant to subdue passion, and in subduing it, render it useful for human enterprise, in the way that a man would break a horse, or tame a dog, or confine fire to the hearth. Those who fail to do this are but galvanized simulacrum of human beings. They are also, as her daughter will bring out in Frankenstein, monsters. Quote, "Am I always to be tossed about thus?" End quote. She asks Imlay, quote, "Shall I never find an asylum to rest contented in? How can you love to fly about continually, dropping down, as it were, in a new world, cold and strange, every other day? Why do you not attach those tender emotions round the idea of home, which even now dim my eyes? This alone is my affection. This alone is affection. Everything else is only humanity, electrified by sympathy." End quote. Again, the image of electricity recurs, now halfway between its original appearance at the hands of Ben Franklin, the scientist revolutionary, and its final expression as the monster created by Dr. Frankenstein. The longer she meditates on Imlay and his behavior, the more she sees him as both a typical man and a human failure, a man whose unrestricted passions have coarsened him to a caricature of what he might have been. Quote, "I shall always consider it as one of the most serious misfortunes of my life, that I did not meet you before satiety had rendered your senses so fastidious, as almost to close up every tender avenue of sentiment and affection that leads to your sympathetic heart. You have a heart, my friend, yet hurried away by your impetuosity of inferior feelings, you have sought in vulgar excesses for that gratification which only the heart can bestow." End quote. If there is any alchemy at work here, it is one based on the traditional psychology of the West. Appetite must be tamed by reason before it can be transformed into love. Quote, "The common run of man, I know, with strong, healthy, and gross appetites, must have variety to banish ennui, because the imagination never leads its magic wand to convert appetite into love, cemented by according reason. Ah, my friend, you know not the ineffable delight, the exquisite pleasure, which arises from a unison of affection and desire, when the whole soul and senses are abandoned to a lively imagination, that renders every emotion delicate and rapturous. Yes, these are emotions over which satiety has no power, and the recollection of which even disappointment cannot disenchant. But they do not exist without self-denial. These emotions, more or less strong, appear to me to be a distinctive characteristic of genius, the foundation of taste, and of that exquisite relish for the beauties of nature, of which the common herd of eaters and drinkers and child-begetters certainly have no idea." Although she didn't know at the time, she would still do one more book. Wollstonecraft was at the end of her writing career. Although she didn't know at the time, she would still do one more book. Wollstonecraft was at the end of her writing career. This was so because her life would be cut short, but it was so for subtler reasons as well. Wollstonecraft, as a result of being treated so shabbily by Imlay, now came to believe in a psychology that was the antithesis of the one that was needed to believe in a psychology, that was needed to produce revolution. The French Revolution had provided a scenario for every progressive psychology which would follow. Those psychologies would become, in effect, parables of revolution, according to which the passions, the peasants, would overthrow the king, reason, on their way to establishing heaven on earth. According to this psychology, the only evil is repression, and any measure which combats repression is legitimate. The same applied to measures taken against the agents of repression, who could be expected to suffer the same fate the Catholic priests suffered at the hands of the revolutionary mob. Wollstonecraft in her letters proposed a psychology that contradicted her politics. Passion was destructive when left untamed by reason. Left unchecked, it destroyed not only the person but the polis as well, in a maelstrom of conflicting desires, as she watched it do to Paris. But more importantly, it destroyed the mind, which adopted the gratification of passion as its highest good. Quote, But it is not possible that passion clouds your reason, as much as it does mine. And ought you not to doubt whether those principles are so, quote, exalted, end quote, as you term them, which only lead to your own gratification? In other words, whether it be just to have no principle of action, but that of following your inclination, trampling on the affection you have fostered, and the expectations you have excited, end quote. The real danger is that reason will extinguish itself in its attempt to rationalize its pleasures. The mind will extinguish reason in its attempt to drown out the guilt, which follows inexorably from acting on those desires. Quote, Beware of the deceptions of passion, end quote, she tells Imlay. Quote, It will not always banish from your mind that you have acted ignobly and condescended to subterfuge to gloss over the conduct you could not excuse. Do truth and principle require such sacrifices? End quote. Given the conclusions she had to come to as a result of her dealings with Imlay, it is not clear that she could have gone on writing without offending the very people who were her most avid readers. She couldn't tell the story of the revolution favorably, without violating her own integrity, and what she had learned from Imlay's treatment of her, but she couldn't tell the story unfavorably either, without alienating her publisher and the revolutionary readers which supported him. So she began to throw about for more drastic ways to deal with the pain. In April of 1795, Wollstonecraft returned to London with her daughter. Imlay not only asked her to return, he sent his servant to accompany her on a journey. If Wollstonecraft had any illusions that her return to London meant a return to Imlay's affection and hearth, those hopes were shattered almost immediately when she discovered that Imlay had moved in with a, quote, young actress, end quote, as Godwin puts it, quote, from a strolling company of players, end quote. Perhaps remembering her attempted menage a trois with Mr. and Mrs. Fuseli, Wollstonecraft even proposed that both the actress and she would share Imlay, because that at least would give her daughter a father. But when even that daring proposal was rejected by Imlay, she decided that death was the only solution to her suffering. In October of 1795, unable to accept the suffering which Imlay's selfishness and neglect had inflicted on her any longer, Mary Wollstonecraft resolved to drown herself in the Thames. Feeling that she might be rescued by the crowds near the water in London, she rented a boat and rowed to Putney, where, after walking around in the rain until her clothes were thoroughly soaked, she threw herself in the river and, in agony, compounded half of suffocation and half of uncertainty, bobbed around like a cork, buoyed up by the stays and corsets she had criticized in the Vindication of the Rights of Women. Finally, a pair of workmen dragged her out of the water and took her to a nearby inn, where she revived and decided to recommit herself to living all over again. At around the time Mary Wollstonecraft tried to kill herself by drowning in the Thames, insurrection flared up in France once again, this time to be quelled by a young Corsican soldier by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. The Marquis de Sade knew nothing of the troubles of Mary Wollstonecraft, and probably wouldn't have cared much even if he had. But he was aware that in the Vendée, the revolution beheld its most significant domestic opponent. With this in mind, Sade turned to polemics once again, and wrote the classic rationale of the revolutionary governments, a speech entitled, quote, "Yet another effort, Frenchmen, if you would become republicans," end quote, which eventually got inserted, and rightly so, into his pornographic tract, Philosophy in the Bedroom. Sade, unlike Wollstonecraft, was learning no lesson in the expensive school of sexual experience. He had fathered children, but the father's experience of birth is abstract compared to that of the mother. The main difference between Wollstonecraft and Sade, and this mirrored the difference between England and France at the time, lay in the realm of morals. Wollstonecraft still had enough of the moral patrimony of the West as part of her lived experience, so that traditional psychology still made sense to her. Sade's decadence, on the other hand, propelled him to a political view consonant with his decadent morals. Neither, however, could go beyond the psychology which the West had bequeathed them. The best Sade could do was turn the traditional view on its head, which is the essence of all revolution, both political and sexual. Quote, "The state of a moral man," end quote, Sade wrote, quote, "is one of tranquility and peace. The state of an immoral man is one of perpetual unrest," end quote. Thus far the quote could have been taken from St. Augustine's City of God, instead of its actual source, which is Sade's Philosophy in the Bedroom. Sade's point is not to revoke what Augustine had to say, but to stand it on its head, and the gist of the rest of the quote is that perpetual unrest, quote, "pushes," end quote, the revolutionary, quote, "to," and identifies him with, the necessary insurrection in which the republican must always keep the government of which he is a member, end quote. Writing at the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire, St. Augustine both revolutionized and brought to a close antiquity's idea of freedom by connecting it with morals. Quote, "Thus," end quote, he writes in the City of God, quote, "a good man, though a slave, is free, but a wicked man, though a king, is a slave. For he serves not one man alone, but what is worse, as many masters as he has vices," end quote. Augustine revolutionized the concept of freedom by connecting it to morals. Man was not a slave by nature or by law, as Aristotle claimed. His freedom was a function of his moral state. A man had as many masters as he had vices. This insight would provide the basis for the most sophisticated form of social control known to man, and the Marquis de Sade was the first to formulate its basic principles. Like St. Augustine, the Marquis de Sade would agree that freedom was a function of morals. Freedom for the Marquis de Sade, however, meant willingness to reject the moral law, the project of all of which were consonant with the use of sex as a form of social and political control, which Sartre was proposing in, quote, Yet Another Effort, Frenchman, end quote. The logic is clear enough. Those who wished to liberate man from the moral order needed to impose social controls as soon as they succeeded, because liberated libido led inevitably to anarchy, as recent events in France had shown. A revolutionary state must foster immorality among its citizens, if it wants to foster the perpetual unrest necessary to foment revolution. Morals meant the advent of tranquility, and tranquility meant the end of revolutionary fervor. Therefore, the state must promote immorality. Given man's natural and inordinate inclination to pleasure, the immorality most congenial to manipulation is sexual immorality. Hence, the revolutionary state must promote sexual license if it is to remain truly revolutionary and retain its hold on power. Over the course of 200 years, those techniques became more and more refined, eventuating in a world where people were controlled not by military force, but by the skillful management of their passions. It was Aldous Huxley who wrote in his preface to the 1946 edition of Brave New World that, quote, as political and economic freedom diminishes, sexual freedom tends compensatingly to increase, end quote. Sartre's claim is related to Huxley's. The best way to make men unaware of their lack of political freedom is to indulge their sexual passions. Both Augustine and Sartre would agree that moral behavior has certain political consequences. Both would agree that immoral behavior has certain political consequences as well. What they disagreed on was their vision of the ideal state. Augustine establishes the fundamental options here as well. There is the city of God on the one hand, which espouses the love of God even to the extinction of self, and the city of man, which espouses the love of self even to the extinction of God. Sartre, the apostle of atheism, was clearly a proponent of the latter city. Since the city of God was based on Christianity's exaltation of love and service as its highest ideal, the city of man as its opposite could only be based on domination, a point which Augustine makes clear at the very beginning of the city of God. Quote, the earthly city, end quote, Augustine tells us, quote, lusts to dominate the world, and, though nations bend to its yoke, it is self dominated by its passions for dominion, end quote. Libido Dominandi, to give the Latin original, is the essence of the revolutionary state. When Lever calls, quote, yet another effort, Frenchman, end quote, quote, nothing less than a reducto ad absurdum, of the theory of revolution and a radical mockery of the Jacobin philosophy, end quote. He is being far too clever, more clever than the text itself, which evidently embarrasses him because of its frankness. In, quote, yet another effort, Frenchman, end quote, the Marquis de Sade gives the rationale for the revolutionary state, which is indistinguishable from Augustine's city of man, which is based on the gratification of passion in general, and the gratification of libido dominandi as its highest expression. Quote, insurrection, end quote, Sade writes, quote, thought these sage legislators is not at all a moral condition. However, it has got to be a republic's permanent condition, end quote. The potential for both control and insurrection, however, undergoes a quantum change when sexuality is deregulated and allowed to act as a stimulant for, quote, perpetual unrest, end quote. In fact, since the revolutionary regime is based on the subversion of morals, it can only exist by exploiting sexuality in this fashion. What it proposes to the unruly mob as freedom, however, is really only a form of political control. The Marquis de Sade makes this perfectly clear. Quote, Lycurgus and Solon, fully convinced that immodesty's results are to keep the citizen in the immoral, again his emphasis, state, indispensable to the mechanics of republican government, obliged girls to exhibit themselves naked at the theatre. Saad's politics, like Weishaupt's, is the classical tradition turned upside down. The key insight of both the Marquis de Sade and the Christian West is that the moral man is in a state of peace. Because he is not in motion, he is, therefore, impossible to direct and control from the outside. The revolutionary's very restlessness, his very rebellion against the moral order, which is the source of his restlessness, holds within it the seeds of control, because once in motion, the state need only manipulate the revolutionary's desire by controlling his passions, and it succeeds in manipulating and thereby controlling him. Sade is not slow in drawing this very conclusion. Lust, in other words, is the force which keeps the citizenry of the Republic from succumbing to the inertia of tranquility, which is the fruit of adherence to the moral order. At this point, we enter into something like a circular argument. Both political systems are self-contained. Morals lead to order. Passions lead to revolution. From the revolutionary point of view, lust is good because it fosters the restlessness of republicanism. But republicanism is also good because it fosters lust. Either way, what we have here is the rationalization of desire as an instrument of simultaneous, quote, liberation, end quote, and control. What was hitherto deemed pathological is now to be seen as the social norm. Quote, we are persuaded that lust, being a product of those passions, is not to be stifled or legislated against, but that it is, rather, a matter of arranging for the means whereby passion may be satisfied in peace. We must hence undertake to introduce order into this sphere of affairs, and to establish all the security necessary so that, when need sends the citizen near the objects of lust, he can give himself over to doing with them all that his passions demand, without ever being hampered by anything. For there is no moment in the life of a man when liberty, in its whole amplitude, is so important to him. End quote. We have here, in a nutshell, the rationale for the pornographic entertainment consumerist culture, which would become the dominant culture in the world by the end of the second millennium. The project at its heart concerns arrangements whereby passion may be satisfied in peace, but with someone making a profit from its gratification. Quote, liberty, end quote, according to this line of thought, is not the ability to act according to reason, but rather the ability to gratify illicit passion, which means that in the very act of attaining his, quote, liberty, end quote, man becomes the thrall of the passion he gratifies. Before long, it becomes clear that Sade's politics is in many ways just the physics he says it is. Man at the beck of passion is in many ways like a particle with no will of its own, since reason, especially morals, is the sole source of man's ability to govern himself. One's gratification of passion becomes the definition of, quote, liberty, end quote. Then, quote, liberty, end quote, becomes synonymous with bondage, because he who controls the passion controls the man. Liberty, as defined by Sade, becomes a prelude to the most insidious form of control known by man, precisely because it is based on the stealthy manipulation of his passions. This was the genius of Enlightenment politics, which is in reality nothing more than a physics of vice. Incite the passion, control the man. This is the esoteric doctrine of the Enlightenment, one that has been refined for over 200 years, through a trajectory that involves everything from psychoanalysis to advertising to pornography, and the role it plays in Kulturkampf. Sade clearly understands that sexual liberation leads to social control, and sees this liberation and subsequent control of passion as the basis of the permanent revolution that life in France would become, once Frenchmen, quote, would become Republicans, end quote. Quote, "No passion has a greater need of the widest horizons of liberty than sexual license," end quote. Saad writes, quote, "Here it is that man likes to command, to be obeyed, to surround himself with slaves to satisfy him. Well, whenever you withhold from man the secret means whereby he exhales the dose of despotism, nature instilled in the depths of his heart, he will seek other outlets for it. It will be vented upon nearby objects. It will trouble the government. If you would avoid that danger, permit a free flight and rein to those tyrannical desires, which, despite himself, torment men ceaselessly. Content with having been able to exercise his small dominion in the middle of the harem of sultanas and youths whose submission your good offices and his money procure for him, he will go away appeased, and with nothing but fond feelings for a government which so obligingly affords him every means of satisfying his concupiscence." End quote. We see in Saad's articulation of principles the system by which the regime can placate sexual interest groups. We see in Saad's articulation of principle the system by which the regime can placate sexual interest groups and thereby maintain its hold on power. There are a number of ironies here, some obvious, some not. One irony is obvious. Once man is freed from the moral order, he is immediately subjected to the despotism of those who know how to manipulate his desires. This is the essence of the Enlightenment regime, not to prohibit, but to enable, to encourage motion or restlessness, and direct the flow of that activity by manipulating desire. This is the political genius behind a regime that is based on advertising and pornography and opinion polls and the other instruments which control, quote, liberated, end quote, man. Quote, "People cry out against the philosophes," end quote, wrote Bernard Burleson, who ran John D. Rockefeller III's Population Council, citing Voltaire, quote, "They are justified in doing so, for if opinion is the queen of the world, the philosophes govern this queen," end quote. Burleson was no stranger to the manipulation of sexual desire or public opinion. He ran the opinion polls on contraception during the early 60s that eventually led to the decriminalization of contraception in Griswold v. Connecticut. But throughout his career, he never forgot his debt to the Enlightenment as his intellectual forebearer in the manipulation of opinion and desire. Quote, "Opinion, queen of the world," end quote, he writes, citing Rousseau, quote, is not subject to the power of kings. They are themselves its first slaves," end quote. The only problem with this system is that it doesn't really work. Passion seems forever determined to break the system which aspires to nothing more than its orderly gratification. So high school students, raised on a diet of sexual laissez-faire, gun down their fellow students, and none of the pundits can fathom why they aren't content to live a life of sexual consumers. To live a life as sexual consumers. Horror, whether in art or in life, is a sign that the Enlightenment isn't working out according to plan. The monster invariably signals the widespread implementation of Enlightenment ideals. Each Enlightenment revolution has its own monster. Sexual liberation leads to anarchy, chaos, and horror, and chaos invariably leads to a form of political control. The regime which promotes attempts to tame the sexual passion in much the same way it controlled steam, electricity, and the atom can never be sure that the passion they, quote, liberate, end quote, won't return to destroy them. Instead of peace based on the tranquility of order, the revolutionary regime offers, quote, liberation, end quote, from the moral order followed by chaos and totalitarian control. We find, then, in Saad a perverse corroboration of the trajectory of horror. We find then in Saad a perverse corroboration of the trajectory of horror adumbrated in the Epistle of James. Passion leads to sin, and sin, when it reaches its fullness, gives birth to death. The trajectory of horror remains the same in both the classical and Enlightenment traditions. Sartre's only dispute with St. James is the values he places on the milestones of the same trajectory. Both admit that sexual passion, released from the moral order, leads to murder, terror, and death. Sartre, however, remains firm in viewing these phenomena through the lens of sexual desire, which is so imperious and all-encompassing that it fails to see them as evil. Vice, it turns out, and not self-interest, is the gravitational force which both moves men and allows the revolutionaries to manipulate them to their own ends. This is the great discovery of the Enlightenment. Those in the grip of sexual passion, as Sartre testifies, know how powerful it is. It was the genius of the Enlightenment to make that passion an instrument of political control. And that discovery was so ingenious because vice, as a form of control, is virtually invisible. Those who in the thrall of their passions see only what they desire and not the bondage those desires inflict on them. Sexual liberation is, as a result, the ideal form of control, because it is virtually invisible. The genius here was not Sartre's, but rather that of Adam Weishaupt, founder of the Illuminati, and prototype for Victor Frankenstein. Weishaupt's genius consists in his use of vice as a vehicle of both subversion and social control. Sartre's genius was to bring out the political implications and applications of the personal control Weishaupt forged. 3 months after her almost fatal immersion in the Thames, on January 8, 1796, Mary Wollstonecraft, now reconciled to life in general, and life without Imlay in particular, attended a tea party given by her new friend, Mary Hayes. Also in attendance was William Godwin, now at the height of his fame as the author of Political Justice, and the suspense novel titled Things as They Are, or The Adventures of Caleb Williams. Both Wollstonecraft and Godwin had attended a dinner party together almost 5 years earlier, but then the circumstances had been reversed. Then Wollstonecraft was famous and Godwin was obscure. Chastened by 5 years of pain, Wollstonecraft did not attempt to monopolize the conversation this time. Perhaps her adversity had enhanced her stature in Godwin's eyes. Perhaps his newfound fame did something similar to her. Whatever the reason, they began to see more of each other. Wollstonecraft then moved into Somers Town to be near Godwin. Then on April the 14th, 1796, she showed up unannounced at Godwin's lodgings on Charlton Street. Thereafter they saw each other daily, and by mid-August their intercourse was as sexual as it was intellectual. Godwin relied at the time on what he called the, quote, chance medley, end quote, system of birth control, which was about as effective as his schemes for social betterment, which meant that Wollstonecraft was soon pregnant. As a result, the couple was faced with a dilemma. Should they adhere to their philosophy of sexual enlightenment and reject the matrimonial bond, which Godwin characterized as, quote, the most odious of all monopolies, end quote, or should they bend the knee to social convention? In the end, social convention won out, and the couple were wed on March the 29th, 1797, at St. Pancras Church, safely before the pregnancy came to term, but not without admitting to friends that they had failed to practice what they preached. It was an admission that would have far-reaching consequences for the next generation. For herself, Mary Wollstonecraft was behaving now less like an angry feminist and more like the docile wife. Quote, I am never so well pleased with myself, end quote, she told him, quote, as when I please you, end quote. On August the 25th, 1797, Wollstonecraft went into labor, delivering a baby girl, which they named Mary. On August the 30th, the Godwins brought in a midwife to assist at the birth, partly because of Mary's modesty and partly because they felt that nature would run its course without much interference. When Mary's uterus, however, refused to discharge the placenta, Godwin called in an obstetrician, who removed it piece by piece, or so he claimed. Mary, however, began running a fever. indicating that either the placenta had not been removed completely, or that she had contracted post-pueral fever during the doctor's ministration. Godwin, thinking that everything was progressing as it should, went about the normal round of his business, but Mary took a turn for the worse and died on September the 10th. Godwin was so distraught that he couldn't attend the funeral September the 15th. However, after a few weeks he was hard at work again, this time writing a memoir about his late wife. Mary Wollstonecraft's reputation might have survived the change in intellectual climate that occurred when England turned against the French Revolution and the spirit of '93, that had made Political Justice a bestseller at the time. But Godwin's memoir ensured that this would not happen. Godwin's memoir described the genealogical details of the birth and her subsequent death with a specificity which the age found shocking. In addition to that, Godwin described her affair with Imlay and the subsequent affair with Godwin in terms that were guaranteed to alienate a reading public that was already disposed to blame Godwin and Wollstonecraft for the corruption of English morals. Godwin's statement in the memoirs that, quote, "not one word of religious cast fell from her lips," end quote, as she lay dying, seems calculated to outrage the sensibilities of the English, and it succeeded in doing just that. The Anti-Jacobin Review did an article of the memoir summarizing everything that was wrong with it, and with Godwin's view on sexual relations, from the fact that it, quote, inculcates the promiscuous intercourse of the sexes, end quote, to the fact that his late wife betook, quote, herself to our enemies, end quote, where, according to her amorous constitution, she documented her adventures as a kept mistress. The Anti-Jacobin Review, founded in July 1798, with the help of a secret government subsidy, announced its aim to expose and destroy the Jacobin conspiracy, which it saw at work in the country. Over the course of the next few years, the Anti-Jacobin Review would pretty much succeed at what it set out to do. The cause of revolution was defeated in the war of ideas in England, and with it the idea of sexual revolution went down to defeat as well. Godwin no longer shone like the sun in the literary firmament. In fact, he had become a hated man. His name had become associated with the term, quote, philosophy, end quote, which in the common mind was never mentioned without a sneer or contempt, and had become synonymous with the name and that of Mary Wollstonecraft, as well as atheism, treason, economic redistribution, and sexual immorality. Godwin's memoirs, appearing as it did when the excesses of the terror were common knowledge, created a reaction that swept the notion of sexual liberation from public discourse, and the names Godwin and Wollstonecraft were linked indissolubly now in the public mind with the theories of revolution that were causing so much carnage and misery in France. The rationalization of sexual vice was just one aspect of the general upheaval in France. In the English mind, he died with the revolution in France on the same bloody scaffold that it had confirmed that passions, unfettered by reason, inevitably led to death. End of Part 1, Chapter 4. Libido Dominandi by E. Michael Jones.